in this section on race, ethnicity, and colonialism and critical race theory. First theorist was Frantz Fanon, and Frantz Fanon writes The Wretched of the Earth. And this is the section that you read that was excerpted in the text. What I put in here as an image to try to, hopefully either expose you for the first time or at least get you to re-remember that British, in particularly British European history, is extremely brutal. Let's see, there's someone in the chat. Let's see. Oh, got you. And so British history and European history is extremely brutal, and colonization is extremely brutal. And Americans don't like to think of themselves as colonists, but basically we are colonists in the same way. It's just that we overthrew the king in our American Revolution. But for all intents and purposes, we're basically the same kinds of people. We killed people instead of in the name of the king. We committed genocide in the name of the founding of our new country. And so this image that you're seeing here is a part of the Zulu Wars, which is where the British were slaughtering African tribes in Africa. And what Fanon is arguing for in his Wretched of the Earth is that we need to decolonize all of these areas that have been colonized by Europeans, whether they be in Africa or in the United States. And this is, I think, a pretty challenging thesis that he's putting forward, because usually I think I imagine like at a college that promotes itself on community service, study, and prayer, that violence doesn't usually come into this. Although, then again, think about the kinds of violence the Catholic Church has perpetrated across the world. But that maybe notwithstanding, most people of faith, or at least like to think that they're peaceful. So Fanon is arguing an opposite thing. He's arguing that we need to violently overthrow our oppressors. And when he means we, he means the people who are colonized. So people of color in the United States need to overthrow the white population and the white oppressors, and the Africans in Africa, they need to kick out the British and other colonizing powers out of their countries with violence. This is not usually the kind of argument that you might hear, probably. I would imagine in let's say your political theory courses in political science. So Fanon is really wanting to get you to understand racial and colonial divides. He wants you to understand colonialism and post-colonialism. And just to, again, get you to meditate on this for a little bit and how different this is. In the first section of the excerpted part of The Wretched of the Earth that you have on page 459, says, concerning violence, national liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, commonwealth, whatever may be the headings used for or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. And my parenthetical is, as colonization was brutal and violent. At whatever level we study it, relationships between individuals, new names for sport clubs, the human admixture of cocktail parties in the police, on the directing boards of national or private banks, decolonization is quite simply the replacing of certain, quote, species of men by another, quote, species of men. Later down on the page, decolonization sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder, but it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of natural shock, nor of friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know it, is a historical process, that is to say, that it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible nor clear to itself in the exact measure that we discern the movements which we give historical form and context. And then here's this another bit on page 460 that I think really speaks to this interesting idea of the need for violence to overthrow oppressors. On page 460, the naked truth of decolonization evokes for us the searing bullets and bloodstained knives which emanate from it. For if the last shall be the first, this will only come to pass after a murderous and decisive struggle between the two protagonists. The affirmed intention to place the last at the head of things and to make them climb at a pace too quickly, some say, the well-known steps which characterize an organized society can only triumph if we use all means to turn the scale, including, of course, that of violence. So again, Fanon is arguing for a decolonization that they need to basically, like, we need to give, not only give the land back if we're white folks, but people who are colonized need to actually forcefully take the land back or take their lives back from those that have been oppressing them. And I'm reacting to some question in the chat. So I think, yes. So this is also for the recording's sake. So would he argue that indigenous people in the United States need to rise up and kick out all the white people? And I would argue, yeah, that's exactly what he's arguing. And he, in some ways, you saw this in 1960s, 1970s. The American Indian movement took over with weapons, different federal buildings out west, and at this. And again, kind of keep in mind that they were like brutally beaten and killed and jailed for doing that, and in a kind of perverse twist, you have people like Clive and Eamon Bundy out west. More recently, white folks who took over federal buildings and asked for snacks and weren't kicked out or beaten or put in jail. So Fanon is definitely arguing that, yeah, the oppressed need to take up arms and they need to violently kick out folks. This is one, just so that you don't, think that decolonization is this always violent thing. This is Fanon's argument. There are other folks who are at other ends of the spectrum of how you might go about working on decolonization. I think on an end that I would probably try to develop further, like more personally, is there's obviously a whole 500 plus years of broken and genocidal relationships between the white folks and people of color and indigenous in this country. And the white folks need to pay reparations in some way and probably figure out ways to give more power and land back. And there might be a way that's less violent than Fanon proposes, but I don't know, maybe not. You guys all see kind of the political situations that we're in as a society right now in the US. So something to consider is that what Fanon is also putting forward is that he's talking about colonialism, and then he's also talking about the fact that just because the British have left India or they've left different colonies in Africa and other colonial powers have left maybe their nations that they'd colonized elsewhere, like the French in Algeria, that the colonial structures still remained. So even though like people in the United States are not citizens of Britain, the colonial structures that we brought with us from our the colonizers that we came from, those structures are still here today. So a part of what he's arguing is that we have, like, America is a post-colonial power. We still are colonial in a lot of ways structurally, even if we aren't straight up colonial in the same way as, say, the image that you're seeing on this slide. So another theorist who's of great importance in thinking through these issues is Edward Said. And Edward Said is talking about two concepts that are really important to try to understand, get a hold of, wrestle with. Said wrote a work called Orientalism, and the point of this analysis was to get the readers to think about how the image of the East, the Middle East, and the Far East are all imaginations of white people. And one of the images that he focuses on is like the one that's pictured here, which is of a harem in the Middle East, trying to something that didn't exist in reality, but a kind of white European masculine portrayal of what white men hoped to find when they went to faraway places in the Middle East and in the Far East. And so this was a way to basically create an other kind of human, the quote, the other, an other, and the other is someone who is less than human and who is notably different, distinctly different from the white Western European. And so you're seeing basically like this image is kind of like the movies of that era. They were basically imaginary creations of things that didn't exist, but were taken as reality by the people who were consuming these images. The people who were consuming these images, they obviously didn't have airplanes. Hopefully you can think about that. And a lot of them weren't likely to actually go to the Middle East or to the Far East. And so they took these images to be the truth of what the East looked like. And so what Ed Said is talking about is how Western European nations basically subjugated the cultures of the world by making them look animalistic and inhuman and distinctly exotic and exoticizing. In other words, this is a way in which white European culture created a kind of hegemony, also created a kind of racism against Middle Easterners, Muslims, Asians more broadly. So a third set of theorists that are important to consider in this set of issues on race and colonization and critical race theory is Michael Omi and Howard Winant. They want you to think about how race is a social construction, and to try to get you to think through that. The image that I've put forward here is of Ellis Island. This is the island in New York City where most immigrants at particular time in the United States history came through this island before they went to other places around the country. And when people went through Ellis Island, they experienced a lot of terrible disease, lack of social service as they were coming into this new country, outbreaks of bed bugs and all kinds of other disease. And also they experienced our American bureaucracy, where basically what happened is last names, first names, family names were changed to sound more American. And also this is where also the first time that people were categorized racially by the American bureaucracy. And so this gives you an entryway into how the United States Census and our American administration um, basically created race, and decided who was what race based on the categorization scheme that civil servants gave people as they came in as immigrants from other countries. This was also a place where some people were sent back to their countries. There's a long history of that in this country. So what Omi and Wanan are also wanting you to think about is it's not just about the social construction of race that's important to consider, but also how we have these regimes of racial formation, that the sort of important categories of race, or the importance of particular categories of race, change over time, and they sort of dissipate and then become much stronger at different points in time in history. Right now, I think we're at a particularly important time of where race has a really negative and important function in our society in excluding people. I think about those, was it 545 children who are still separated because of our current administration, separated from their parents, that is. And what all of this amounts to for Omi and Wanan is how our society, and many other societies as well, are structured in a kind of racial dominance. So what I wanted to come back to then is, so if you look on page 470, Omi and Wanan, race is a social concept. Race is indeed a preeminently socio-historical concept. Racial categories and the meaning of race are given concrete expression by the specific social relations and historical context in which they are embedded. Racial meanings have varied tremendously over time and between different societies. In the United States, the black-white color line has historically been rigidly defined and enforced. White is seen as a pure category. Any racial intermixture makes one non-white. Yep, going backwards. So here's one, the last theorist, David Roediger, in this section. And one of the reasons why he's in this section is that he gives you an entryway into how you're hearing some pretty critical perspectives from people of color who are in the academy at that in those eras, a little bit towards the middle and late century of the last century in the 1900s. David Roediger is a white academic who is highly critical of his own whiteness, and he is trying to develop this idea of how whiteness actually, in a lot of ways, not only harms people of color, but actually harms poor white people. But at the same time that it harms poor white people, it gives poor white people something, a tiny thing to feel better about themselves with, in the stratification hierarchy of our society. And so Roediger, in his excerpt on the wages of whiteness, he's talking about his own upbringing and how what's important and often missed in discussions of race and ethnicity is how race and social class overlap with one another, and they also then start to co-determine each other. And what he was putting forward in this set of writing was how the formation of the white working class was a way to keep Blacks and people of color and indigenous in their place in the stratification system. And so the image that I put in this slide is of well, in 2016, they called themselves deplorables. This is a Trump supporter. Something that's, I think, very interesting and on point with Roediger's ideas is how and why poor white folks and working class white folks vote against their best economic interests in favor of people like Trump, who obviously don't care about them, but at least sing the praise of that it's better to be white than another race. So just to, again, give you some further on this, if you look at page 475, so these tastes did not supplant racism. Most of them were decidedly pre-political, but they did open up the possibility of anti-racism. My own experiences pushed me in that direction. The city of Cairo continued to decline, and now with my quote uncle as mayor, I had developed the habit of going to church in a small Catholic church for blacks there, originally because that church's white priest raced through the mass in half the time that it took at white church. This black parish gradually became a center of civil rights activity in Cairo, and I increasingly was made to wonder whether whites were ruining the town, and as they had the swimming pool in order to hold on to white supremacy. And I identify this quote because I think it's important to think about the sort of context in which these theorists are growing up in. And also, I would like to connect what he's writing about with the swimming pool and the whites controlling the swimming pool space in Cairo to the similarity of, I don't know if you guys know about swimming on Reed's Lake. You can't swim in Reed's Lake unless you're in the EGR Yacht Club. And so a part of that is a similar control. The yacht club is obviously a white space and place, and that excludes Black folks and other people of color from swimming in Reed's Lake.